Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I have a really great conversation with one of my favorite writers, Geoff Manaugh. Geoff is probably most known for publishing BLDGBLOG, which is a blog about architecture, landscapes, and the built environment that he founded in 2004. But he's also recently published a book called A Burglar's Guide to the City, which is about the relationship between burglary and architecture, and has actually been optioned for television by CBS. And he also writes frequently for publications like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the Daily Beast. In this episode, Geoff and I talk about his early interest in writing and how he discovered that architecture was this really interesting intersection for all of his varying interests. We talk about blogging and the form of the blog post. And we also talk about how architecture writing has changed over the years and new ways to think about both architecture and design. I've been reading BLDGBLOG for years. If you've listened to almost any episode of this podcast, you know how influential blogging was to my interest in design, and BLDGBLOG was one of those. And Geoff's writing really shaped how I thought about blogging when I started my own blog and started thinking about writing about the topics that were interesting to me. So I obviously really enjoyed this conversation. I love talking to him about his own writing and interests and how his career has evolved. If you don't read BLDGBLOG, I encourage you to go visit the site and take a look at the archives and enjoy this conversation with Geoff Manaugh. You know, I've been reading BLDGBLOG for years, but I don't actually know much about both the origins of the site and your own background. And so I thought that might be a nice way to just kind of frame the discussion a little bit. And so I'm kind of interested to start where your interest in architecture and the built environment came from, and then also where your interest in writing came from.
Sure. Well, I guess I'd start maybe with that last bit, which is that I think writing is actually something I've always been interested in. Okay. So, you know, even as a little kid, when I was, 5, 6 years old, I was writing short stories and that kind of stuff. I was really into the Greek myths. So I was, I'd rewrite the Greek myths for almost like fan fiction.
Oh, nice.
I turned in like an entire novella when I was like 9 years old. It was, like this massive 81-page short story about people who got lost in the rainforest.
Oh, wow.
And so that was something I was always really interested in, and was writing and becoming a writer and being a writer. And so I think that definitely came first. Okay. And then as far as the built environment, I guess I felt like it was always the sort of, I sometimes joke that it was at the center of the Venn diagram for all of my interests. And so, if I was interested, as I was as a kid, in becoming an archaeologist, it was about ruined cities in the middle of these wasteland landscapes or hidden in the rainforest and that kind of thing. But that's architecture. You're talking about these ruined cities or abandoned walls and that kind of stuff. But then I was also interested in science fiction and how they portrayed the cities of the future, or for that matter, the landscapes of other planets. But then I was also interested in war and the military and how they prepare for conflicts, both overseas and domestically, and the kinds of things that go into military bases, or even what weapons do or do not do to cities and that kind of thing. And so on and so forth, horror fiction and then architecture itself, material science, all the things that go into it. But so that was kind of at the center. I realized that I could actually kind of surreptitiously write about everything that interested me, and I could just I could pin it on architecture and start an architecture blog. And that was just a great excuse to be able to find ways to get in touch with people who did stuff I thought was interesting, or to write about topics that I was excited about to share with other people and so on. And so BLDGBLOG really kind of came out of that. So my background is not actually architecture, ironically. Okay. So I never studied architecture, and I'm not an architect. But it just has that really well-positioned thematic relevance to all of the things that I like to read about and study, etc. And so my background is really more in anthropology and art history. And so it's those kinds of topics that I think, if anything informs what I do academically, it's really more that kind of Anthropology, how do human beings use the spaces they build for themselves? How do human beings interact with each other in a certain scenario? And then as far as art history, I just think, maybe just a visual acuity or an attraction to images and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the background. And then I guess I'd say that at the time of founding Building Blog, I feel like there's been a dramatic change in what is written about in the architecture world since that time. But when I did start Building Blog, it was really more of a reaction to the fact that, I was genuinely interested in architecture, but as an outsider and as someone who, I didn't have academic access to libraries and that kind of thing. So I'd go to Barnes and Noble and look at the architecture section, and even today it's kind of a wasteland of really uninteresting books. And it just seemed like, wow, how can there be an entire field that is so fascinating and so important and interesting, and yet the stuff being written in it is so boring? And I really wanted to write what I wanted to read, and so I thought, why aren't more people covering these kinds of things? Like, why can't you read about J.G. Ballard and architecture? Right. Which now you can't get away from J.G. Ballard and architecture, but back then it was kind of unheard of to even mention him in the context of architectural writing. But so those kinds of things, wanting to, almost like proof of concept as an outsider to show that you could write about architecture in a way that brought in all these other influences. Yeah.
It's always interesting to me. I love that because, one, I feel like that explains a lot of some of the other questions that I wanted to ask you. You set them up for me really nicely. But I also love when kind of all of these topics or all of these interests were just there kind of from a very young age, and how they kind of manifest themselves kind of as you grow as a writer, as an intellectual, or kind of whatever you would want to call yourself. I'm interested though, because you said, I have just kind of one other quick background question to kind of pull out of that. Sure. At a very young age, wanting to be a writer and then kind of studying anthropology and art history, where did those things come together for you? Or where did you, what was there a moment, I don't mean to kind of oversimplify it, but was there a moment or an object, or when did you realize that architecture was that thing that, you could kind of tie around all of these interests?
That's a good question. I guess there were a couple moments. Like academically, I was really interested in, like when I was an undergrad, I did an undergraduate thesis project, and it ended up being about agoraphobia. Okay. And so I actually came around to agoraphobia by way of, I guess what I would broadly say was anthropology and critical theory. It was just and I started getting really interested in how fear of public space was being described in books about agoraphobia. And so I started reading more about it and getting more interested, I guess you could say critically, in whether or not agoraphobia was even real. If it was not just other types of social anxiety that were being portrayed inaccurately as a spatial problem, because it's almost inevitably described as something about being out in public space, or being seen in a large piazza or on a street or that kind of thing. But inevitably those are just, it's almost like that's a spatial coincidence, and in fact it's a different type of anxiety. And so in any case, I wanted to start writing about that kind of stuff. That got me in for the thesis project, which got me into looking at how public space is described, how anxiety disorders are seen spatially. And that was architecture. So that led me to some pretty interesting sort of mid-20th century writing on what happens when people move to cities. How does it affect, the way people think? Does it cause a kind of frenetic change in brain activity and stuff like that? And so I don't go down that route anymore. I'm not particularly interested in those types of questions as much as I was when I was younger. But that was, that was a moment. But then also, I guess, again, it was kind of a slow burning thing. It wasn't like there was a moment at which I saw architecture burning in the sky above me and I was converted. It was more that there was just a long laundry list of things that was making me realize, my God, like this is also architecture. So I'd be reading a horror novel, and the way that the house was described at the center of it, or the way that the abandoned city was described, I'd realized that was an architectural example. And then when I realized I was really into, how mines, like underground mines, are created and engineered, I'd realized, this is effectively kind of reverse architecture. Or even, while watching the movie Die Hard, I realized, my God, the reason why I think I liked Die Hard so much as a kid it is effectively a movie about a skyscraper. It's an architectural film that takes how people move through the built environment as its very premise.
Right.
And
right.
so, I just began to have this kind of slow growing sort of snowball effect where I realized that, architecture was everywhere. So it was more like a list of 100 things as opposed to just one converting moment.
I love that. I mean, it's so great. I'm curious kind of where, you had mentioned that Building Blog kind of started as you kind of wanting to read. You wanted to write the type of kind of architecture writing that you were interested in reading, and you started the site in 2004, I think, right?
Yeah,
And so that's kind of right at the kind of early kind of start of blogging. Where did that idea come from, or how did the idea of, this is going to be a blog where I'm going to write about these things?
Well, I mean, I guess there's a couple things there. I mean, one is a kind of boring answer to that is just simply that it was the appropriate format for the time. I mean,
right.
I could imagine that if now perhaps maybe I'd start a podcast, or maybe I would
right.
do some other type of startup like publication that
right.
that I had
okay.
control over. So those are, it was just sort of, that was the thing that was around at that time. Although I do think that blogs are undervalued today. Personally, I think that they're a very, very good outlet for people who too often just sort of waste their thoughts on Twitter and Facebook. But in any case, maybe that's something we can come back to. But
I definitely want to talk about that more.
Yeah, but then briefly, I'd also just say, I suppose maybe the more interesting answer to that is that I just feel like, and I think perhaps you would agree with this, that the things I cover on Building Blog are so usually oddly framed that there just is not much. I would not be optimistic that if I pitched those articles to an editor, that they would agree to publish them.
Right.
And so, I'll cover something where it's a book that came out 7 years ago, or for that matter, 45 years ago, or it's a random moment in a movie that has nothing to do with architecture that reminded me of something that led to a blog post, or it's a description of a material breakthrough in crystallization growth, and that reminded me of a J.G. Ballard novel, which then turns into a Building Blog post. And, those kinds of thought processes just simply don't pitch well. And so, I think that if I were to get in touch with somebody at the New York Times and say I wanted to write a stream of consciousness article about crystallization and J.G. Ballard, I think I'd be a pretty unemployed writer. So I think that the benefit of Building Blog, especially in its early phase, was just that you could just write whatever you wanted to because it's free. It's yours. You don't need to pitch anything. You just need to have enough caffeine in your system to write it. So it was kind of it was a dream outlet, as it were, for a writer.
Right. And I think that's kind of why. So I kind of came of intellectual consciousness and kind of discovered my interest in graphic design largely through blogs. And, when I was in high school in the early 2000s and I grew up in suburban Pennsylvania and had never met a real designer before. And this was right at the height of blogging. And so the blog post form was actually very fundamental to me in kind of understanding this thing that I now do 15 years later. So it's a form that I have a soft spot for. And I do think that it's undervalued. And it's why I think Building Blog is so interesting, and you started to touch on this a little bit, is that it's so just fundamentally you, and it's I read it, and I have read it for years as this kind of almost like open research project in a way, or it's kind of just whatever you're interested in or thinking about shows up there, but in a way that is very accessible and doesn't seem, maybe at first glance like it's just whatever you're kind of interested in at the time. So I'm interested in kind of like how you think about writing for the blog, or writing for yourself, really. What's that process like of kind of posting to Building Blog versus writing something for the New York Times or the Atlantic or the kind of other publications that you write for?
I mean, I guess a couple things. I mean, I think that one of the things that I always have liked about Building Blog is that it isn't. It's a minimal financial expenditure on my part, and in fact, until only about 2 years ago, it was entirely free because it was hosted at Blogspot.
Oh,
So
right.
it was buildingblog.blogspot.com,
Right.
which meant that I had literally no capital invested at all into Building Blog. And so, I had no obligation to keep going. I had no sense that I had sunk hundreds or even thousands of dollars into some sort of web hosting platform or web design that I had paid for, et cetera. So it had a feeling of, it was there if I wanted it, and if it wasn't there, I wasn't obligated to do anything. And so there was no like emotional labor, I guess you could say, in terms of like knowing, oh shit, I have to post again tomorrow, or there was never any stress involved with that. But then also, it meant that because I didn't go down the path of extreme site monetization, it wasn't the way I made a living, and so that also took a huge amount of pressure off, so that I was just writing for myself. Like it was a voluntary thing. Like if something interests me, I'm going to write about it. But if it doesn't interest me, like if there's a news in the architecture world, or there is something that I should be academically obligated to cover, I just didn't, because after all, like this is voluntary time. I could go outside, I could go to work, I could talk to friends, or I could sit at home and voluntarily write this stuff for the last 13 years. And so, in some ways though, I think the benefit there is that also, from my point of view, the benefit was that it meant that I didn't have to cover things I didn't want to. But from the other point of view, it's always been interesting to me over the last decade or more when people get upset with Building Blog because I don't cover things that they think are, the true ethical questions of the time, or something that is academically, absolutely. It's something that is academically burning and that I should be covering X, Y, or Z. But it's a voluntary thing. Like I'm not doing this because I'm paid by a university, or I'm not being paid by for those readers, for that matter. You know what I mean? Like their clicks aren't paying my salary. So I just feel like I can cover whatever I want to. It's not. I don't need to make sure I also post the newest trailer for a blockbuster film where I can talk about the architecture, because I'm just trying to get clicks. So there were a lot of things that were a benefit there. In terms of how does that differ from writing for major publications? I mean, I think that I guess it's good and bad. I mean, there are times where I feel immensely frustrated working with editors because I think, they're trying to change things less because it makes it better and more because it makes it more appropriate for their publication. And that doesn't necessarily mean the article gets better. But on the other hand, I feel like there are pieces that I've done that are so much better than anything I would have done on Building Blog, precisely because I had that editorial input. So that's been really great. And then, of course, also there are times where I'll write something on Building Blog as just sort of a short post and then think, my God, I kind of wasted that idea. I could have written a feature for Wired magazine about that, or I could have really turned that into something that would have been appropriate for my editor at the New York Times Magazine. And instead, I just sort of, the equivalent of like spitting out the car window, I just sort of, threw this idea onto Building Blog, and I sometimes kick myself like, shit, I should have done something more with that.
Oh, interesting.
But,
I kind of want to connect some of that to something that you had said earlier about kind of, architecture being this frame or this box that, all of your other interests could kind of fit into. And I think the site has always been like that. And I think your writing has always been like that. And I'm thinking specifically kind of about two pieces that you wrote within, I think these were in the last year, so I hope they weren't older than this. You wrote a piece for the New York Times about kind of self-driving car technology and how they see the city. And then I'm also thinking about a series that you did for the Atlantic, which I think was last summer, kind of about, I think it was like about satellite imagery at like a very high level. That's kind of what it was about. And those two pieces specifically, I think, are very Building Blog topics and are very you topics. And I don't know if I'm just more conscious of it now that I've been reading you for this long, but I feel like your interests maybe have expanded a little bit to, you are writing a lot more explicitly about technology, about science, about climate change, about space, as in like, outer space, not, kind of physical space. And I kind of want to, I'm interested in how you kind of, I guess first kind of, would you agree with that? And then also how that maybe relates to what you were saying earlier about how the architecture discourse has changed. Has that changed kind of where you're turning your gaze? Do you know what I mean? That was kind of a weird way to phrase that. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I think that, yeah, I guess there's a couple kind of nested answers there. I mean, I think that I guess I feel like because of Building Blog, I feel less inclined to want to cover architecture for other publications,
Right.
which might sound strange, but I feel like although people think of, or I should say many people think of me as an architecture and design writer, I tend to resist it when an editor gets in touch with me and wants me to write an article about the future of elevator design or some new building in Dubai or
Right.
those types of things. Because even though I am technically an architecture design writer, I feel like those ironically aren't the things I want to be covering for other publications. Where I'd rather have the opportunity to write about satellites or how
Right.
machines see the city or the emergence of artificial intelligence and infrastructure, that kind of thing. So those are the things that are I guess more interesting to me as pitches for those magazines. But as far as like the design world changing in terms of the discourse, I mean, I do think that as things that used to be marginal have become much more mainstream, and I mean everything from J.G. Ballard to sort of like pop avant-garde archigrammian sort of stuff that is now
Yeah.
again it's actually frustratingly ubiquitous. I feel like I just simply don't want to cover that stuff
Right.
anymore. It feels like, first of all, I feel like I've already sort of made my thoughts known, so I don't really know why I would go back and do it, even though there's a whole generation of people that don't even know I've ever written about that stuff because it's buried in the archives of Building Blog.
Right.
But nonetheless, I feel like I just am not going to go back and rewrite all of that. But also I feel like, I mean, the ironic thing too is that, I started off as a very, very, like I said, I didn't study architecture. I was, I mean, at the time, I wasn't even really a published writer. I was just sort of a guy. I mean, I was the cliche of a guy, at home in his underwear writing blog.
Right.
And then, it was only maybe, 6 or so years after I founded the blog, for a variety of reasons, all of a sudden, I'm teaching architecture at Columbia.
Right.
And so I feel like what was interesting there was that it was suddenly stepping into the academy and seeing how architecture was taught and seeing what people consider valuable architecture writing, which really clearly didn't include the stuff that I was doing.
Yeah.
Also meant that wanting to enthusiastically covering architecture for free on a voluntary basis at home with using my free time to do that became less intriguing to me because I kind of felt like, wow, okay, so these are the people in the academy
Oh, interesting.
who actually teach architecture and feel as if they are the true gatekeepers for what passes for architectural discourse.
Right.
And it was, I mean, I don't know, it's like the cliche, like a scene where, you sneak into a country club and then somebody mistakes you for the guy who empties the trash can in the bathroom. It makes you not want to go back to that country club.
Right.
And so there was something about teaching at Columbia that was a pretty bubble popping moment for me, where it just didn't seem like I don't really want to volunteer my time to get excited about a field that these people are part of too.
Right.
And so what I'm getting at is that means that just encouraged me even more to write about non-architectural things. So, writing, climate change, satellites, archaeology, like all the things. I guess you could almost say that, how I described it earlier as a Venn diagram with architecture at the middle.
Yeah.
I guess I say like the diagram still holds and I'm still interested in all those things, but I tend now to sort of put a piece of electrical tape over the word architecture, and now I just write about all the other things.
Right.
And
I mean, that this is interesting, and it leads to two other things I wanted to kind of talk to you about, is because, in talking about the things you want to write about, I can't see you writing kind of a review of a new building. That doesn't seem like something that you would do at all, really, the way an architecture critic would. But I'm interested. The other kind of thing that I was curious about is how you think about audience and the audience of both Building Blog and your other writing, and even your book, which I'd like to talk about in a bit, and then that relationship to the architecture community. Where do these things sit related to that, which I'm sensing is probably more removed than maybe it would appear.
Yeah, I guess I think, I mean, if I understand the question right, I mean, I guess I think of my audience, or just audience in general, as definitely interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
So it's even though there has been a positive response from what I guess I might say architecture students, even if not architecture faculty, would be that there's also, though, interest in people who work in set design or who work
Right.
in screenwriting for film and TV or who work in the music field because of the stuff that I occasionally cover from acoustics and sound and
Right.
audio questions about the built environment. So the audience for Building Blog, I think, is pretty well distributed amongst different fields. Even people in anthropology and archaeology, for that matter, I know read this site. And then of course architecture. But I think that paying attention to all of those potential readers is actually quite important because it makes you not, or rather, the editorial goal for me would be to not get overly distracted by one route in particular, so that everything I cover is just one topic over and over and over again. But every once in a while, remember that I'm interested in sound and acoustics, so I should look to see if there's something worth writing about in that field as well.
Right.
But I'm not necessarily sure that answers your question, but I think that just making sure that remembering that the audience for architecture, or rather that for these types of topics is pretty broad and exists in different fields.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I was curious about, and I'm kind of asking it through. I'm kind of, vaguely asking it while I'm processing it through the lens of graphic design, and a lot of the people that I talk to who are in the graphic design profession, and when we talk about graphic design writing, it's often towards writing for other graphic designers, and I'm always curious about how to write about these things for a general audience or for people who are not as close, and you're someone who I think does that a lot. I don't feel like you're writing for architects or for urban planners, although I think those people get things out of your writing also.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that some of that too, though, is that when you're in a field, you sort of, or one sort of tacitly accepts a canon of references that
Right.
you're supposed to make. So, an example comes up and it's assumed that everybody will know that, this is something where I need to cite Jane Jacobs or Walter Benjamin, or there's something that everyone will understand this core group of references. But I think that once you step outside that and instead you reference, a contemporary action film that might have an example that that proves your point much better
Right.
than an essay published, 15 years ago in a canonical academic journal. You start instantly and already not only establishing tone, but also saying to your audience that the things they've experienced or seen or are familiar with are also worth discussing in the context of these other questions.
Right.
And that you're not just doing that thing where, I'm writing an essay about graphic design, and so that I therefore have to talk about X, Y, and Z, or I'm writing about architecture in the city, and thus I have to refer to these 3 or 4 canonical texts.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the benefit of blogging is that if you write as if your thesis advisor is not watching, you will be able to get a lot more done in terms of your own excitement for what you're doing, but also just the kinds of people you can bring into the conversation. Because, just don't make the obligatory references that everyone expects.
Right. And I think that really manifests itself a lot in Burglar's Guide to the City. And I think,
Sure.
I feel like that book is just your writing just like taken to the next level. Like it's still very you, but in this kind of long form, a little bit more narrative. I'm interested in kind of where that came about, because I know from reading the blog that these were topics that you had been thinking about for a while. Did changing to a book change your process or change kind of how you thought about these things at all?
Well, definitely. I think that in general, what's been exciting for me as a writer is moving to a different type of writing. And so being able to, and not be scared to pick up the phone and call people and do first person reporting for topics that, too often, I think even myself several years ago would just rely on, an article in New Scientist or someone else writing in the New York Times or, someone else's reporting. I would just use that as a proof of something that I had been thinking about. But I feel like as I've gone from being a blogger to being a journalist, which I suppose just the best way to phrase it,
Right.
Being able to work on stuff in a much longer form, as well as with original input from people I myself have met or interviewed, I think is something that has been really exciting, which, I realize somebody listening to this podcast would just be, that's journal. I just described journalism, it's like, so,
right. Yeah.
That's not exactly revelatory, but to go from being, just a random commenter at home on my own blog, to being somebody who, flies around with the Los Angeles Police Department, like that for me was just a really great transformation in my writing career. And so, with Burglar's Guide, I also just feel like knowing that you can structure something over 200 plus pages as opposed to over 800 plus words was also a really exciting way to be able to move in and out of certain themes or structure things in a more delicate way, or really kind of drill down on certain topics that I normally would have just passed over with, literally sometimes just a link. Like I'll just link to someone else's work and be done with it. But here I actually, went into it on my own and had to figure out what it was that interested me about it. So it was definitely it was all of those. And then also, just very briefly too, speaking of that Venn diagram, what was so interesting to me was just that burglary was kind of like an architectural conversation hiding in plain sight. It literally requires architecture. You can't be a burglar if there aren't any buildings. You can be a thief, you can be a pickpocket, you can be any number of things but you cannot be a burglar unless it involves a building. And so that right there just seemed like, how on earth have not more people written about this?
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to explore that line between what it means legally and conceptually, that the very creation of architecture also brings into being this criminal class. And what does that criminal act reveal about how we design or think about architecture in terms of blind spots or vulnerabilities or conceptual possibilities for redesigning it? And so those were the types of things as well, like in terms of that Venn diagram where architecture was at the middle, but yet it had all of these other things around it. So,
yeah, it's almost interesting. I don't know if I thought about it this way until you started saying, until kind of what you just said, in that I think you could almost view the book as kind of a microcosm of kind of your larger writing interests, where you're kind of approaching architecture, but looking at it through the lens of someone else. And I watched a talk or an interview or something that you had done on YouTube, kind of in preparing for this, and you had mentioned that idea about burglary can't exist without architecture, and it is just kind of like, there are all these other lenses through which people view the built world that I don't see, that the architects don't see, that the city planners don't see. How has that been? I'm curious, kind of the response to that, and if there have been other kind of similar narratives that have spawned of people looking at things this way, kind of from your book, or looking at architecture that way.
Well, yeah, I think that the book, in broad strokes, I think that it's been really interesting to watch how the book is read in different fields. So, I know people from the law enforcement community who have read it and gotten in touch. Mm-hmm. Even on the book tour, I met people from firefighting who were, came up to me afterward and explained how it's so interesting because as a firefighter, like you're thinking about the exact same things, like the placement of walls or how floor plans affect ventilation practices for helping extinguish, or for that matter, keep fires located in a certain part of a building. But, it's a very engaged architectural action to fight a fire. And so, they were realizing that as I described how burglars might cut holes through walls, or how they might look at floor plans as a way to find the vulnerable room that they can break into, or for that matter, the vulnerable apartment, it was very much almost like thinking like a firefighter. And then people in the architecture world, have been, relatively interested, I think, in the book, but then also lots of people in the kind of film and TV world, where the book was actually optioned for television, which is pretty exciting.
Right.
And so, there's been a broad sort of narrative interest in the book and where it wanted to go. As far as people who are, directly inspired by A Burglar's Guide to work on stuff, I don't necessarily know that I can point to like, the book that just came out last year is also sort of, was a writer who was inspired by Burglar's Guide.
Right.
But I do think that general class of, one of the things that I mention every once in a while is, many, many years ago, like maybe even 12, 10, 12 years ago, there was an IDEO project, IDEO, the design consultancy, where they were looking at how people misuse everyday objects. So, using like the what is it called? Like the rack, the railing that you hold onto on the subway, using that to hang dry cleaning on, or adding things to the drink holder in a car so that you could navigate or put your cell phone in it, or that kind of thing. But so it was basically like people using design trickery and creativity to misuse the built environment and misuse the everyday environment so that it could perform some other unexpected function. And I think that, burglars are doing almost literally, well, for that matter, and police officers are doing the exact same thing. So they're figuring out a way to turn a windowsill into a climbing platform so they can get up to the second floor apartment, or turning an alcove into a place to hide because there's more shadow there when the streetlights turn on at night, or using privacy fences in the backyards of someone's house, not to keep the neighbors from seeing someone eat breakfast alone at home, but just to keep those neighbors from seeing them climb in and steal things out of the bedroom. So it's this conceptual kind of redirection of the everyday environments, and I think that other people have definitely been writing about that kind of stuff. But once again, for whatever reason, maybe it was a moral thing, or maybe it just wasn't just something that anyone wanted to do. There just didn't seem to be much of an acknowledgement that burglars are thinking on a design level about how to engage with buildings, and so that's one of the things that I wanted to do as well with the book.
And I think that's just the perfect description of kind of why I've been drawn to your work, and I really like this Venn diagram that you've mentioned a couple of times, because I feel like that applies to my own life and my own interests, but with graphic design as that middle piece, and everything from kind of maps and national borders could be seen as design problems in a sense, or acts of graphic design, and how design in the large sense, but also graphic design, architecture, all of these things influence so much of the way we live and interact and move around the world. And that kind of realization has really changed how I think about my own work, both as someone who talks about design and writes about design, but also as a practicing designer. And so I kind of want to step back a little bit, and I'm interested in kind of what are the topics that you are seeing people in architecture, design, technology, all these things that you are kind of orbiting. What are the topics or subjects that people seem to be talking about a lot, or that you wish more people were talking about?
Well, I guess I'd say, one thing that is, two topics that I think that I think are becoming more and more ubiquitous. One is just a generational thing. Well, as people move to cities more and more, and thus write about cities more and more, there's a focus in general on how cities can be changed to let people, questions of transportation and mobility. And so, looking at pedestrianization schemes or redesigning streets to allow more cycling or that kind of thing. I think that that's not just a generational question in the sense that, younger people want more physical options for getting around town, but also it's a demographic thing. It's an economic thing. People who can't afford cars, who don't want to afford a car, who are convinced that self-driving cars are only 4 years away anyway, and so why buy a car?
Right.
They want to find a new way to get around cities, and so questions of transport, especially in an age of Uber and City Bike and Jeanette Sadiq Khan, all these people, you're getting these questions popping up more and more, and pretty mainstream publications as well. And then obviously I also think the general challenge of statelessness and refugees, I think, is also something that pops up all the time, where for entirely justifiable reasons, about what does it mean that we have built a world where people don't have a place in it, and is there a design response? Is there a legislative response? Is there an urban or architectural response to the fact that there are people who literally don't have a place in the modern world?
Right.
And that's clearly kicked off by a lot of conflict in the Middle East right now, but it's also something that I think will only increase when we have climate change refugees and increased conflict spreading around the world. So I think that those are two pretty major questions. A really dumb thing, I think it just, I'm consistently amazed doesn't get more negative attention. And I think it's just because of nobody wants to insult their friends, but I'm just consistently blown away by what seems to me to be a kind of inability to control software being mistaken for a new design language. So you've got all of these designs emerging that just look like stainless steel Venus flytraps and these utterly ridiculous plant forms that are mistaken for biomimicry. And the fact that more people aren't pointing out how ridiculous of a waste of time it is to do that, and the fact that not being able to play your instrument is now being mistaken for being a virtuoso. And I just think it's software that tends towards plant forms is just being let go and not controlled by architecture students. And then they get A's from faculty who also don't really have anything invested in what is being produced under the guise of their studios. And then you've got just this epidemic of ridiculous plant forms coming out that aren't the future of architecture. And also, again, they're not a sign of skill. It's the opposite. You just sit back and let your software design these things. But, maybe that's a more controversial opinion than I think it is. But I guess I'm under the impression that more people think that than they admit to it. And yet entire schools are getting away with designing plants instead of buildings.
Right. That's interesting. I have not thought about that, but I know exactly what you're talking about. That's actually really interesting. And that leads to, I have just a couple questions just to wrap it up. Two of them are fairly easy. One might be a little bit bigger. But two of them are directly related to kind of what we were just talking about and may be very similar answers. But I'm kind of interested almost in kind of the inverse of what we were just talking about, and what are the subjects that you're really interested in right now and that you're thinking about a lot and writing about more and more?
I guess a couple things. I am actually very, I guess in a post-Burglar's Guide way, I am extremely interested in law enforcement and how it engages with the city. And so I'm definitely interested in those types of topics. So how policing, because policing is a design act. You design a beat or you design a jurisdiction, and you find a way to engage with the pre-existing design of the city in a way that you think makes that city safer. And it, obviously, as we've seen, it doesn't always work. So you've got all kinds of moral, ethical, and force-based questions emerging about how cities should be policed, et cetera. But those kinds of things interest me more and more. So, I've been writing more about, counterterrorism and infrastructure and policing and those types of topics. I'm increasingly interested actually in communication, but I'm also working on a slightly longer project right now that I haven't said very much about publicly. But so topics like that are definitely of interest to me.
I'm curious. This is kind of a big question, and it might be a little bit abstract, but I'm interested in the way, I'm almost hesitant to use the word architecture now, kind of hearing you talk about the way you think about these things, but the way I'm not even sure exactly the best way to ask this, but I'm interested in, as someone like yourself who's maybe a little bit more removed from graphic design, the way you write about the subjects you're interested in, are there parallels you see in graphic design, or the way maybe people should or could write about branding, identities, kind of the visual culture?
And I guess, I feel like, if I'm an outsider to architecture, I'm certainly an outsider to graphic design. But I do think, though, that graphic design is so ubiquitous that I think that just more pointing out to people, it sounds like a niche field, but it actually isn't. So, it's the thing, everyone sees it literally all the time, in every single product they pick up, and every book or every report, every Microsoft Word document they look at, every email they send, they're looking at graphic design. And I think making it clear that therefore they actually do have an opinion on graphic design, and it's okay to talk about it without being pretentious. I think is one of the major things that I was aware of in terms of the architecture world, where, actually everybody thinks about architecture, whether it's their fantasy house or the fact that they hate a new skyscraper, they nonetheless are thinking about architecture, and making them realize that actually, this is not the super pretentious embarrassing topic that you are entitled to have an opinion on it.
Right.
I think graphic design could do the same kind of things, but I do think though that, as you mentioned yourself earlier, expanding what it might mean to talk about graphic design, I think is pretty exciting. So is a national border a type of graphic design? Is a landscape, especially in an age of Google Earth where you're looking at things from above, is the placement of plants in that landscape actually graphic design? Are you building a visual interface between a property and people who might view it? Questions like that get away from pure typography, or at the very least get away from what would be the word? I guess a meaning-bearing typography, and instead you look at simply the arrangement of things in space as a type of graphic design. Suddenly you open up a lot of really interesting fields, like where even choreography becomes a type of graphic design. The movement of bodies in space. I mean, for that matter, a bank heist would be graphic design because of where you place people to guard the front door. So in any case, once you start really picking apart what it means to arrange things in a legible manner, and then that's graphic design, suddenly you've opened up the floodgates to a lot of really interesting other topics that would normally be considered outside the field.
Yeah, I love that. That's so great. That was such a great answer. I mean, I'm smiling right now. You can't see me, but that was so great. My last question, I'm really interested in kind of, the books, the writers, the people that you find yourself returning to again and again, or the texts that you find yourself returning to again and again, or the people that you recommend the most to other people. Just what's that reading list that's really shaped how you think about all of these things?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, my answer is actually just sort of your standard sort of cliched, like white guy reading list. So unfortunately, I'm not sure it's very interesting, but I definitely would say people like Franz Kafka and J.G. Ballard and Don DeLillo have all been, just really interested me in terms of how they represent the way people act in space. So, giving narrative framing to how people use complicated architectural scenarios is something that is definitely of interest to me. But then there's some academic work actually that I think is really interesting that I tend to go back to quite often. There's a really great book called The Tomb of Agamemnon by a woman named Kathy Gear, and which is kind of like, it hits all of my sweet spots. So it's about the classics, so teaching sort of like the Iliad. And how that led to a general European interest in antiquity, which then got sort of monstrously distorted into a kind of pro-military interest in ancient Greek culture, as archaeologists were uncovering things like the Tomb of Agamemnon, and then how that seeped into the popular discourse to inspire people to go to fight in World War I. So it's just a really great short look at how archaeology, the classics, the manipulation of public opinion and mythology in general can be sort of cooked up into a really toxic brew, and yet it's also just a great, short, well-written book. And so stuff like that, it hits a lot of sweet spots for me. So I really enjoy that. But yeah, I mean, I guess the list goes on and on. I mean, I read as much as I can, and I read quite often. So I think that I've got, I've recently gotten really into detective fiction because of my whole crime and law enforcement interests. So I've been reading tons and tons of detective fiction, primarily set in Los Angeles, but also New York and London. I've read a lot of horror novels. I when possible, I read tons of nonfiction, like from climate change. And Elizabeth Kolbert is a really great writer for climate change issues. There's a cool book about species modification and its possible effect on what we define as wildlife. There's a book called Frankenstein's Cat by Emily Anthes, which is quite good.
Oh, wow.
But so, yeah, I just think, in general, I would say read as much as you can. And when in doubt, buy some random magazine that is related to a field that you have no interest in, like a tactical sailing magazine or for that matter, a fashion magazine, if that's not your thing, because it's just really, really fascinating to see the topics they discuss and even how they discuss them. Yeah. And to realize that, perhaps you actually have interests that overlap with that world and you didn't know it until you actually read the printed matter from that field.
Right. Yeah. I love that. That's exactly kind of why I asked that question, is just from reading you over the years, it was very clear that your reading list was wide and far ranging. And so it was kind of great to hear you kind of parse that out a little bit. Geoff, thank you so much for talking to me. I've been, like I mentioned a couple times, I've been reading your site for years, and your writing has come up on previous episodes, and so I was really looking forward to this, and I thought this was so great and interesting. So thank you so much for talking.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for the invitation to be on. Thanks.
This episode was recorded on July 24th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.